Thanks for coming today. I'm really excited to get to speak with you all. And I'm going to share my screen and some slides and introduce myself, and then we'll get going. And we'll definitely try to leave some time for Q&A. My name is Shannon Vallor. I'm the Bailey Gifford Chair in the Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence at the Edinburgh Futures Institute at the University of Edinburgh. And if you're not familiar with Edinburgh Futures Institute, or EFI, our aim is to promote interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research on the sort of complex challenges facing humanity in the future that really require integrated approaches where data-driven innovation is not approached independently from the arts, humanities, social sciences, and other disciplines that are really necessary in order to guide the building of our futures in responsible and sustainable and just ways. And within the Institute, we have a new Center for Techno-Moral Futures, which I direct, which really involves research that focuses on integrating moral knowledge and skill development and moral intelligence into technical intelligence, and thinking about how those two kinds of expertise can grow together. My background is in philosophy. I'm also appointed in the Department of Philosophy at Edinburgh, but I'm the sort of philosopher that likes to spend a lot of time building bridges outside of philosophy and outside of academia as well. So what I'm going to talk about today isn't going to look much like a philosophy presentation. It's really about how we think about the kinds of work that technology does for us in society. So I'm going to talk about that work and what happens when we delay or defer that work and build up what I call moral debt. So first of all, when I talk about moral work, I'm talking about the kind of moral labor that societies and institutions have to perform in order to survive. So you can think of societies like living organisms. They have to perform certain labors of self-repair and renewal internally in order to flourish. And humanity teaches us, and we're seeing today this be played out in a very grim way in a number of countries, that the will of people to live together in relations of civic trust and mutual aid is a very fragile thing. And it's something that has to be maintained by moral labor. And if you don't, within your society, perform that labor, the costs can be very high. So moral debt is what I'm calling that burden that accrues in a society and institutions when they borrow against public trust and civic fellowship by deferring the essential moral labor that's needed to address these deep structural problems in society that need to be managed. And so when we delay or defer or put off or shirk that moral labor that I'm talking about, and we allow a very high moral debt burden in society to accumulate, the result is typically declines in social cohesion, security, and collective resilience to crisis. And we're seeing right now the costs of allowing that burden to accumulate to unsustainable levels, because it means when that crisis hits, the society's response to that crisis is going to be powerfully degraded. So what does moral debt have to do with innovation? And particularly, I'm going to focus today on data-driven innovation. So I want you to think about innovation as something that can be directed to empower leaders and citizens to help pay down moral debt. It can be a way to invest in social renewal and repair. But too often it's actually used to temporarily patch, defer, and disguise our moral debt, further accruing moral interest. The way that these debt burdens tend to amplify social stresses and raise the risk of a costly cascade of social dysfunction. Innovation also adds to moral debt when it leads society to rely upon shallow, temporary, and unstable technical fixes for deep structural problems, whether they be rising social precarity and inequality, decaying physical infrastructure, fraying civic ties and cohesion, weakened social safety nets, endemic social injustice and unfairness, declining democratic participation, unsustainable resource consumption. All contemporary societies are dealing with these challenges to varying degrees, and technology has a role to play in addressing all of these. But there's a difference between enlisting technology in an intelligent, well-coordinated social response and relying on technology as a sort of band-aid or technical fix that can be implemented without the accompanying social or political effort. And that's usually what fails. Innovation can itself add to society's moral debt burden if new tech is designed, developed, or deployed in ways that ignore ethical risks to society or push those costs onto its most vulnerable members. And we've seen a lot of this happening as well. So I want you to think about 3 different types of innovation that relate to moral labor. One is technology that enables the moral labor of a social body to be performed by people more easily, quickly, or effectively than is otherwise possible. So think about the telephone and the way that it enabled certain moral labors, checking on your family, maintaining ties in your neighborhood, coordinating emergency responses. Telephones allowed a lot of that moral labor to be performed in ways that were more immediate and effective than before. There's also technology that automates moral labor in a social body. It enables the same labor to be performed mechanically. So think about the difference between having a person at an intersection performing the moral labor of ensuring people's safe passage and negotiation of that intersection, and the replacement of that person, a sort of traffic safety officer who could make that intersection safe for people, and the replacement of that with something like a traffic light that automates that function. We also have technology that substitutes for shared moral labor in a social body and replaces it with another kind of functionality. So if you think about the ways that markets traditionally operate with moral labors of trust and relationship building, that make sure that the market functions because buyers and sellers are in relationships of trust and reciprocity that allow the market to flourish. But what we've seen modern technology do in many contexts is strip away that foundation and replace it with things like automated financial auditing that doesn't perform any kind of moral labor, but still allows the system to operate more or less smoothly. So we can think of computing systems in particular as moral extenders. They're extenders of moral labor. They either enable us to do more moral labor. I think that's actually the preferred option. They can automate that labor for us. So think about, for example, closed captioning as an automated system that allows the moral labor of making communications accessible more broadly to be done by a machine. And then think about technologies that substitute for moral labor by doing something very different. So instead of, for example, human management and supervision, which involves the moral labor of building certain relationships of mentorship and guidance for employees, think about substituting that with security cameras that monitor employees, that track their activities, that penalize them routinely for certain performances or failures of performance. And that's really substituting for moral labor as opposed to automating it. So moral debt is something that we can think about in parallel with a related social phenomenon that's known quite well to software engineers, and that's something called technical debt. So I think it's useful to draw this parallel if the concept of moral debt is still something that you're struggling with, but you're familiar with this concept. So technical debt accrues in software systems when the pressure to deliver a working product in a timely and cost-conscious manner leads a software designer or an engineer to forego certain technical measures that are needed to sustain product usability, stability, safety, and user trust over the long term. So this leads to a product that works now, but is likely to require even more costly fixes, mitigations, or redesigns later to keep it working. So this is why we say that technical debt accrues interest. So this term was coined back in 1992 by Ward Cunningham, we talked about the fact that when you're shipping code for the first time, you're always going into a little bit of this debt because you can never make anything perfect. You can never put an infinite amount of effort into making sure that the code is robust and that will work under all possible conditions. And in fact, he says a little bit of technical debt speeds development as long as it's paid back promptly with a rewrite. He says, but however, when you take on too much technical debt, it can bring your entire engineering organization to a standstill. And we see a similar dynamic play out, I think, with moral debt, where a little bit of moral debt is sustainable. A lot of it can break down an institution or an entire society. So going back to technical debt, so what are examples of technical debt or things that cause it to build up? So these are just some of the examples and some of the shortcuts that we take perhaps, or weaknesses in code development that can increase technical debt. But what are the sources of moral debt, particularly in data and AI systems? So think about the lack of user and public stakeholder input that we see causing problems in a lot of these systems, where we don't learn until much later on that the systems don't work or are harmful for users or other public stakeholders. Think about the failure often to do an adequate analysis of the dual use or abuse potential of a technology, or any other kind of rigorous moral hazard analysis. Think about failures to test adequately for accuracy and fairness for diverse users. We've seen a lot of examples of this lately, of technologies that don't work appropriately, for example, for individuals with darker skin tones, or who that don't work as well for women because they weren't tested in a way that reflected the needs of those populations. Think about the failures of customer and user education to prepare them for the limitations, risks, potential failure modes, and inappropriate uses of a data-driven tool or AI system. We often see failures that result from having postponed implementation of known harm mitigation. So it might be that you have done the analysis and you know what the risk is, but you put the product out before you figured out how to mitigate against that risk, and then it's already out there in the world doing harm. In other cases, we don't know because we haven't done the analysis, so that's the moral debt. And then we also don't do any post-deployment monitoring for unanticipated harms, interactions, or novel system behaviors. So then we have a scenario where the harm builds up to quite a significant level before we become aware of it because we weren't looking for it. So these are ways of building data and AI systems that are likely to accumulate unsustainable levels of moral debt. And this is what leads to, and this is riffing off of a quote by Lily Irani, minimally socially viable data and AI systems that require even more burdensome and costly fixes, redesigns, moratoria, regulations, audits, investigations, hearings, and harm compensations later. So just like technical debt, moral debt accrues interest. The more of it we take on, the more we pay later. So just to sum up then, there are three different kinds of moral debt we can think about in the context of innovation. One is delay or neglect of the shared moral labor that any society has to perform. Another is the compounding social cost of relying on new technologies as patches or workarounds or band-aids or offsets for that neglected moral labor. And a third is the burden of neglected moral labor that builds up within technical systems themselves when they're not developed in responsible and ethical ways. So I'm arguing that today the moral debt we've accrued through these practices has come due at the worst possible time, precisely when we needed to draw upon the principle, if you will, to continue with the metaphor, i.e. public trust in scientific, technical, and government expertise needed to collectively manage the global public health crisis that we're living through. So the reason that we're failing in many countries to effectively respond to the pandemic is because that public trust that we needed to sort of cash out in order to use the best scientific and technical potential to implement a public health strategy. We didn't have the buy-in from the public in many countries that we needed, precisely because we've borrowed against it by building up moral debt in other socio-technical systems. So I'm arguing then that really, if we think about ethics as something that ensures that we don't take on too much moral debt in socio-technical systems, or that we pay down the moral debt appropriately, then I'm arguing that ethics is actually a cornerstone of sustainable innovation. And given the challenges that we're facing to sustaining the kinds of societies that we want to live in, and I'll just sort of flag all of the doom saying threats that we're thinking about today, not just the pandemic, but more broadly, collapsing public trust in institutions, biodiversity and other environmental collapses, and the problem of information pollution, this sort of conspiracy theories and disinformation that spreads through our communities at light speed. These are all challenges to sustainable human futures. And they're not going to be met unless we get better at observing and understanding our environment, our built systems, our own actions, and how all of these impact one another. Now, fortunately, data-driven technologies offer powerful new tools for gaining that understanding. We can use these tools to better understand how systems are interacting, how people are interacting and being affected by these systems. And we can use them to anticipate some of the responses to the threats that we face that might be successful. But data science and AI used poorly actually obscure more than they reveal. Data science and AI used irresponsibly undermine public trust and civic cooperation, and they degrade our information and physical environments further. And we've seen examples of that as well. And data science and AI used unjustly will deprive people of their rights and opportunities to flourish. And think, for example, of the ways this has already happened in cases where, for example, facial recognition systems that routinely misidentify people with darker skin tones have led to people being unjustly arrested and jailed, and caused people to suffer severe lifelong harms as a result. So ethics is what ensures that data science, AI, and other new forms of innovation can do the work for us that we need them to do. So we need to pay down the moral debt that's accumulating in our technical systems. And the factors that are driving that debt accumulation are the following. The first is that shared moral labor is really not commonly recognized as part of technical work. And it's less recognized as part of technical work than we see in older innovation cultures. So think about the ways that safety and interest in public welfare and reliability are better integrated into civil engineering, biomedical research, aeronautics development. Those are all forms of innovation that actually tolerate far less moral debt than we see happening in the data and AI context in other domains of innovation today. We also see that practical ethical skills aren't being widely integrated into technical curricula. And this ends up limiting ethical ownership and confidence among technologists. So you'll see a lot of engineers say, look, I'm not an ethicist, don't ask me. This isn't my expertise. I don't have the skills to think about these things. And that really also undermines our capacity to readily identify ethical risks in technology and reliable ways to manage them. Because the people who are closest to the technology often have the information that's needed in order to foresee these ethical risks. So if the ethicists aren't close to the technology and the technologists aren't prepared to deploy ethical skills or analysis, then there's really no way to manage these threats. We also see relatively few compelling career rewards in tech for investment in ethical skill development. Things are somewhat better in that it's now seen as nice to have in many technical organizations. So if you have some expertise in sort of ethical product development, that might be seen as a plus. But it's certainly not seen in most industries yet as a necessity. And we also see finally the continuing externalization of much of innovation's moral debt. That means that the costs of moral debt are still getting pushed on to end users, citizens, vulnerable groups, institutions, and the public commons. It's not being paid for by the people who are generating the debt. It's not being paid for by the technologists, by the companies and their shareholders, or the venture capitalists that are investing in the companies. And so this creates a moral distancing effect, or worse, an illusion of moral solvency, because the moral costs that are being generated aren't often visible to those who are actually imposing them on society. So what do? We respond to these 4 things. The first thing we need to do is to remodel innovation cultures and accountability structures on technical domains in which innovation is highly valued, but moral debt is less easily tolerated. So often these older professions are sort of seen as less innovative by kind of newer generations of technologists who think that data and AI represent the cutting edge of everything. But actually those innovation cultures can learn a lot from looking back at earlier innovations and professions that have already matured and developed some of this ethical competence. We can also do better at integrating skills of domain-specific practical ethics throughout technical education. So this is not a question of taking a one-off ethics course that you learn very quickly, isn't seen as part of your core technical development and not seen as a skill-building course. Instead, we need to teach ethics in a way that expands the core definition of technical competence to include ethical reflection and care, responsibility, and moral creativity in design, so that you're not a good technologist unless you have these skills in your toolkit. And we need to re-internalize these moral externalities that are being generated by innovation. We need to restore compelling incentives not to knowingly or negligently impose moral harms on users or on society, whether that's through loss of professional reputation and career opportunity, or exposure to legal or market penalties or restitution for the harms caused. And then finally, we have to communicate the necessity and desirability of moral solvency in technical practice. And it's important to remember that innovation today, I think, is being held back more by growing public distrust and often legitimate fears and resulting lack of cooperation by public stakeholders in innovation than it is by a lack of good ideas or talent. And there's some research to back this up. A French market research company, Capgemini, recently did a study of AI development and found that something like 40% of proposed sort of AI deployments had been paused or scrapped as a result of ethical concerns that couldn't be satisfactorily addressed. So I think we can communicate better that progress in innovation actually requires more attention to this moral solvency. So the concluding thought I want to leave you with then, and open up to discussion, is the claim that ethics is not a roadblock to innovation. It's in fact the only way we have forward. Thank you.